We know the Philistines are one of the great enemies of Israel. And they're gathering around, and the Israelites in chapter 13, they don't have a lot of weapons. Verse 25 of chapter 13, on the day of battle, that neither sword nor spear was found in the hands of any of the people who were with Saul and Jonathan. But they were found with Saul and his son Jonathan. So there's this great threat that the Philistines are posing before the Israelites. And we get to chapter 14, and we see Jonathan takes initiative. He grabs his armor bearer, and he says, let us cross over and let us go to the Philistines' garrison. And his plan is to attack the garrison. And then you get to verse 2, and what is Saul doing? It just describes Saul as sitting under a pomegranate tree. Seems to have very little concern about what is happening in the danger that he is in. And then as you continue throughout that story, Jonathan sets up a plan with his armor bearer that if they go to the Philistines and the Philistines say a certain phrase, then this is going to indicate that God is with them and that they can attack. And so Jonathan presents himself to the Philistines, and they say that phrase that indicates that the Lord would be with them, and he tells his armor bearer to attack. So it is just Jonathan and one other man, and they attack a Philistine garrison by themselves. But he knows that the Lord is on his side. He has great faith that the Lord will deliver victory to them. That's what he says in verse 12. So the men of the garrison held Jonathan and his armor bearer and said, come up to us, and we will tell you something. And Jonathan said to his armor bearer, come up after me, for the Lord has given them into the hands of Israel. Then Jonathan climbed up on his hands and feet with his armor bearer behind him, and they fell before Jonathan, and his armor bearer put some to death after him. That first slaughter which Jonathan and his armor bearer made was about 20 men, with about a half a furrow and an acre of land. And then we see this causes great trembling within the Philistine camp. And Saul, they hear this great commotion and they wonder what's going on. And somebody tells them that Jonathan has attacked the Philistine garrison. And then they gather together and they go and attack the Philistines. And there's a great slaughter on that day. But it's all because of Jonathan and his faith in God that he and one other man go and they slay 20 Philistines. When we think of great stories of faith and courage, I think Jonathan is right up there with David, who slew the giant Goliath. He had this amazing faith. And that's really how we're introduced to David. David were first introduced because Samuel tells Saul that God has taken away his kingdom and that God has found another man to replace him. And what was the defining characteristic of the man that was going to replace Saul? He wasn't like Saul, because when we think of Saul, Saul looked like a king, right? It describes Saul as head and shoulders above everybody else. He had the physical stature. He looked the part of the king, but he did not fulfill the role of a strong leader. Instead, when he told Samuel to find this new king, he says he doesn't look at the outside, but he looks at the heart of man. And as we know throughout the Scriptures, David is described as a man after God's own heart. And then in 1 Samuel 17, we see the story of David and Goliath that we all know well, where the giant Goliath was challenging Israel, and everybody was afraid and they trembled. And he gave this challenge for 40 days. He would come out into the valley and he would ask any one of them to battle. And the winner of that battle, the loser, would be their slaves. And nobody would fight him because they were all scared. But David, who brings food and supplies to his brothers, he hears this challenge and he asks about this man, and he describes him as this uncircumcised Philistine who defies the armies of the living God. This wasn't necessarily about David and him wanting to do this, but this was about a man who was uncircumcised. That's the idea of he's ungodly. He's an idolatrous worshiper, and he's defying God. And that is what upset David. So David goes out, and we know the story. He defeats the giant. He defeats Goliath. And we see that throughout chapter 17. And then we're introduced to the relationship between David and Jonathan in chapter 18. But let's begin here at the end of chapter 17, because it takes place right after David slays Goliath. And beginning in verse 54, it says there, "Then David took the Philistine's head and brought it to Jerusalem. But he put his weapons in his tent." Now when Saul saw David going out against the Philistine, he said to Abner, the commander of the army, "Abner, whose son is this young man?" And Abner said, "By your life, O king, I do not know." The king said, "You inquire whose son the youth is." So when David returned from killing the Philistine, Abner took him and brought him before Saul with the Philistine's head in his hand. Saul said to him, "Whose son are you, young man?" And David answered, "I am the son of your servant Jesse the Bethlehemite." Now it came about, when he had finished speaking to Saul, that the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as himself. Saul took him that day and did not let him return to his father's house. Then Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as himself. Jonathan stripped himself of his outer robe that was on him and gave it to David with his armor, including his sword and his bow and his belt. So the scene here where we're introduced to the relationship between Jonathan and David is right after David slays the great giant Goliath. And it's important to note that connection, I believe, between the end of chapter 17 and the beginning of chapter 18. Because I believe you see the foundation for this close-knit relationship that they have with one another. Jonathan is admiring what David has just done. He's admiring the faith and the courage and the godly character that David just displayed in going and defeating Goliath. It is right after that we're introduced to this, as it is described, a close-knit relationship. That Jonathan, it says it twice, loves David as he loves himself. So Jonathan sees this man. He sees this great warrior. He sees this man of great faith. And because of that, he has admiration and he has respect for him. And I would imagine it would not have taken long for David to have noticed the faith and the character of Jonathan, and to hear about what Jonathan had done and the courage that he had shown in his life. And because of both their strong and godly character, they have a friendship that is based on those things. And they love each other as they love themselves. This is a relationship built on mutual respect and admiration. It's a friendship that is based on sacrificial love. That's what it means when it says that Jonathan loved him as he loved himself. And you find that as we're going to go throughout the rest of the narrative, you see that type of love that Jonathan had for David. That he was concerned for his well-being. He was concerned for his life all throughout his days. And that teaches us something about the nature of friendship. You know, a lot of people try to have friends where they can solely get something out of that relationship. When maybe it's financial needs or physical needs or whatever it may be. Now, true, strong friendships, there's going to be many blessings that come out of that, no doubt. But it first must be based on not what you can get from them, but it's based on this sacrificial type of love that they had for one another. It's that idea that Jesus talks about, the golden rule, right? As we describe it now. That you want to treat others how you desire to be treated. And Jonathan and David treated each other in just that way. And like we introduced, as we continue in this story. Here's another amazing contrast that we see between Saul and Jonathan. Jonathan sees the heroic actions of David with Goliath and the Philistines, and he has nothing but admiration and respect for what David has done. He is thankful for what David has done in defeating one of the enemies of the Lord. Whereas, what is the reaction of Saul? How does Saul view what David has just done? He views it with envy. He views it with jealousy. He has an evil spirit come about him. We see David and Jonathan make the covenant of friendship in verse 3 and 4, but beginning in verse 5, it says, "So David went out wherever Saul sent him, and prospered. And Saul set him over the men of war, and it was pleasing in the sight of all the people, and also in the sight of Saul's servants." So we see it's pleasing in everyone's sight, but it never says it is pleasing in Saul's sight. In verse 6, "It happened as they were coming, when David returned from killing the Philistine, that the women came out of all the cities of Israel, singing and dancing to meet King Saul, with tambourines, with joy, and with musical instruments. The women sang as they played and said, 'Saul has slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s.' Then Saul became very angry, for this saying displeased him. And he said, 'They have ascribed to David 10,000s, but to me they have ascribed thousands. Now what more can he have but the kingdom?' Saul looked at David with suspicion from that day on." So we see here, David, all that he did was help Saul and help Israel. Everyone else within the kingdom of Israel was scared of this giant for 40 days. David delivers a great victory, not for himself, but for the kingdom. Saul should be thanking David. Saul should be praising David. But he is jealous. He is envious as all the people are praising David and the great works that he has done. And he looks at him with suspicion from that day forward. He doesn't rejoice that the enemies of the Lord are being destroyed. No, he's filled with bitterness. He turns his focus on the one who is giving that deliverance. And he looks at him with suspicion and envy. And immediately in verses 10 through 16, he immediately begins to try to kill David. It came about on the next day that an evil spirit from God came mightily upon Saul. Or a depressing spirit, might be a better translation there. A depressing spirit from God came mightily upon Saul, and he raved in the midst of the house, while David was playing the harp with his hand as usual. And a spear was in Saul's hand. Saul hurled the spear, for he thought, "I will pin David to the wall." But David escaped from his presence twice. Now Saul was afraid of David, for the Lord was with him, but had departed from Saul. Therefore Saul removed him from his presence and appointed him as commander of 1,000. And he went out and came in before the people. David was prospering in all his ways, for the Lord was with him. When Saul saw that he was prospering greatly, he dreaded him. But all Israel and Judah loved David, and he went out and came in before them. So Saul, in his anger, he becomes depressed, he becomes distressed, and he tries to kill David on this occasion. And then as you continue on in the story, he's going to try to kill him again. So we see Saul is threatening the life of David. But what does Jonathan do? We see Jonathan as the great friend of David. He does everything that he can to protect him. We see that friends will protect one another. And in chapter 19, this is just after in chapter 18 where Saul tried to kill him once. And then in verses 20 through 30, Saul tried to outsource the death of David. He tried to set up a trap for David so that the Philistines would be the one to kill David. And in chapter 19, every man begins to hear about Saul's plans to kill David now. It says in verse 1, "Now Saul told Jonathan his son and all his servants to put David to death. But Jonathan, Saul's son, greatly delighted in David. So Jonathan told David, saying, Saul, my father, is seeking to put you to death. Now therefore, please be on guard in the morning and stay in a secret place and hide yourself. So Jonathan hears straight from the mouth of Saul, because evidently at this time Saul is now just telling everyone to put David to death. This distresses Jonathan because Jonathan greatly delights in David. We know the type of relationship that they had. So Jonathan, upon hearing this, he immediately goes to David and he makes sure that he is protected, that he is safe, that no harm will come to him. He says, go and hide in a secret place because my father is trying to kill you. And then we see Jonathan go and he speaks to Saul, and we'll speak about that in just a moment. But Saul hears the words of Jonathan, and in verse 6, it says, as the Lord lives, he shall not be put to death. That was Saul's vow to Jonathan. But just shortly after that, all you have to do is go down 2 more verses. It says, when there was war again, David went out and fought with the Philistines and defeated them with great slaughter, so that they fled before him. There was a depressing spirit from the Lord on Saul as he was sitting in his house and with his spear in his hand, and David was playing the harp with his hand. Saul tried to pin David to the wall with the spear, but he slipped away out of Saul's presence so that he stuck the spear into the wall, and David fled and escaped that night. Then Saul sent messengers to David's house to watch him in order to put him to death in the morning. But Michal, David's wife, told him, saying, if you do not save your life tonight, tomorrow you will be put to death. So we see again that envy and that jealousy and that bitterness overtakes Saul because David gives Israel another great victory, and immediately he tries to put him to death again. Chapter 20, we see it again. He's threatening David and his life. He tries to put him to death. But Jonathan, he says that I will protect you. Whatever you say, I will do for you. He provides protection for his friend. And there's great application for us in this point today, that friends provide protection for one another. And the type of protection that we should be focused on today is spiritual protection. That we must, as friends, help each other overcome the wiles and the darts of the devil. That true friends can be a rock, and they can be a source of help, and they can be a source of protection from the devil and the temptations that he places before us. We should be able to rely on one another. We should be able to help one another as friends. Galatians chapter 6. Galatians chapter 6, beginning in verse 1. Speaking to the brethren in general, he says, brethren, even if anyone is caught in any trespass, you who are spiritual, restore such a one in a spirit of gentleness. Each one looking to yourself so that you too will not be tempted. Bear one another's burdens, and thereby fulfill the law of Christ. For if anyone thinks he is something when he is nothing, he deceives himself. This idea of bearing one another's burdens, this is in the context of spiritual temptation. It's in the context of spiritual trespasses. As brethren and as friends, we need to be helping one another overcome these sins that confront us, these temptations that confront us. That is our responsibility as brethren of one another today. Then back in 1 Samuel 19, as we continue the story there. 1 Samuel 19, after Jonathan tells David that his father is seeking to kill him and to go and hide, he continues in verse 3. And he says, I will go out and stand beside my father in the field where you are, and I will speak with my father about you. If I find out anything, then I will tell you. Then Jonathan spoke well of David to Saul his father, and said to him, Do not let the king sin against his servant David, since he has not sinned against you, and since his deeds have been very beneficial to you. For he took his life in his hand and struck out the Philistine. And the Lord brought about a great deliverance for all Israel. You saw it and rejoiced. Why then will you sin against innocent blood by putting David to death without a cause? Saul listened to the voice of Jonathan, and Saul vowed, As the Lord lives, he shall not be put to death. And then Jonathan called David, and Jonathan told him all these words. And Jonathan brought David to Saul, and he was in his presence as formerly. We see Jonathan has nothing but praise for David when he speaks to him before his father. Jonathan recognized the sacrificial actions that David took in taking on Goliath. He says he took his life in his own hand to slay the giant. He's done nothing to sin against you. All his actions have been beneficial. He speaks of his great faith. He speaks of the fact that the Lord is clearly with David. And when we think about what Jonathan is doing here, we have to recognize that this took great faith and boldness for Jonathan to do this. Not only was Saul his father, he was also the king of Israel. And Jonathan already knew that Saul desired to kill David, that Saul hated David. Yet this did not change what Jonathan said about David. He recognizes, Jonathan probably would have recognized, that Saul could have him put to death. In that same story that we began with in 1 Samuel 14, when Jonathan goes to the Philistine garrison and he defeats them, and then the rest of Israel gets involved in the battle, Saul foolishly makes an unwise vow where he says that no Israelite can eat or drink anything before all the Philistines are defeated. And Jonathan is obviously not there because he's the one who has initiated the battle. He never hears that decree from Saul. And in that story, Jonathan eats some honey because they're in a field and they're tired, and all of Israel is famished from fighting the Philistines all day. And Jonathan eats the honey, and one of the Israelites tells him that Saul had made this decree, and it was a foolish decree. And so when they get back, they find out, they cast lots, and they find out that it was Jonathan that had eaten the food. And Saul says to put Jonathan to death. He was willing to put his own son to death because he made an extremely foolish vow. What's interesting in that story, the rest of the servants of Israel will not put Jonathan to death. They say, Jonathan has done nothing wrong. You have made a foolish vow. They stand up for Jonathan. And so Jonathan is not put to death on that day. But I go back to that story to emphasize this point. Saul would have gladly put his son to death. He was willing to do it earlier. So Jonathan going before him and speaking nothing but words of praise about this man, David, that Saul hates. It took great courage and it took great boldness. But that is what a friend does. They speak highly of one another. They praise one another. They don't try to speak poorly of those who they call their friends. And Jonathan does exactly that. And as you continue, as you get to 1 Samuel 20, we can see at this point Saul listens to him in 1 Samuel 19. But as we noticed, immediately after, when David does something great again, he starts to try to kill him again. And then in 1 Samuel 20, when Jonathan goes before Saul again and he begins speaking about David again, what is the reaction of Saul this time? In verse 30 it says, Then Saul's anger burned against Jonathan, and he said to him, You son of a perverse, rebellious woman, do I not know that you are choosing the son of Jesse to your own shame and to the shame of your mother's nakedness? For as long as the son of Jesse lives on the earth, neither you nor your kingdom will be established. Therefore now send and bring him to me, for he must surely die. But Jonathan answered Saul his father and said to him, Why should he be put to death? What has he done? Then Saul hurled his spear at him to strike him down. So Jonathan knew that his father had decided to put David to death. Then Jonathan arose from the table in fierce anger and did not eat food on the second day of the new moon, for he was grieved over David, because his father had dishonored him. So we see when when Jonathan speaks about David here again in 1 Samuel 20, we see the anger that it aroused in his father. We see him throw his spear at Jonathan. So yes, this took amazing courage for Jonathan to stand up for David, to protect David, to speak words of praise about David in the hearing of his father. This wasn't a friendship of convenience. This wasn't about what could Jonathan get from David. No, it was endangering Jonathan's life at this point to be this close friend of David. But he did not waver in his friendship. When it says that Jonathan was knit to David, when it says that he loved him as himself, this is what it means. That nothing was going to destroy this friendship. Not his own father, not the king of Israel. Oh, he was closely knit and he truly loved him as himself. And then next of all, we see friends provide and they help one another. Earlier in chapter 20, this is right after Jonathan had spoke to Saul, and Saul had vowed that he wasn't going to hurt David. And then we see Saul immediately begin attacking David a little bit later. But evidently Jonathan did not know this yet. And in verse 1 of chapter 20 it says, Then David fled from Naioth in Ramah, and came and said to Jonathan, What have I done? What is my iniquity? And what is my sin before your father, that he is seeking my life? He said to him, Far from it, you shall not die. Behold, my father does nothing either great or small without disclosing it to me. So why should my father hide this thing from me? It is not so. David vowed again, saying, Your father knows well that I have found favor in your sight. And he has said, Do not let Jonathan know this, or he will be grieved. But truly as the Lord lives, and as your soul lives, there is hardly a step between me and death. Then Jonathan said to David, Whatever you say, I will do for you. You see Jonathan's reaction. He doesn't know that Saul has gone about and he's changed his mind and he's trying to kill David again. But he hears the pleas and he hears the distress of David. David says, There's hardly a step between me and death. And Jonathan's reaction to that, he says, Whatever you say, I will do. He's there to help. He's there to provide for his friend. David comes to Jonathan completely distressed and deeply concerned about his life. And Jonathan is there to be that help, to provide for him in a time of need. There's applications for us today. Yes, help can include physical necessities, but I believe the more important thing that we can provide as friends of one another is helping each other with our emotional and our spiritual needs. David was in a state of emotional turmoil. He was in this state of depression and distress because he knew death was knocking at the door. And who did he go to? He went to Jonathan. And Jonathan was there to be that rock and that foundation of help for him. And he leaves him with these comforting words, Whatever you say, I will do. And as you continue on in that story, they create this plan. Jonathan is going to go back to his father and truly find out his father's feelings. And if his father is determined to kill David, he was going to come out and he was going to shoot 3 arrows. And if he told his servant to go pick them up in a certain area, that would tell David Saul's intent. And so they create this plan, and Jonathan finds out, as we read at the end of chapter 20, that Saul desires to kill David. And Jonathan gives David the signal that he needs to leave and that he needs to find safety. And that brings us to verses 41 and 42, where we see that friends, they will rejoice with each other and they will weep with each other. We saw the first point earlier when David defeated Goliath. Jonathan rejoiced over that. He was happy over that. He was happy that the enemies of God were defeated. They both rejoiced over that. And then we get to verse 41, when they have to separate, when Jonathan gives him the signal that David must flee. Verse 41, it says, when the lad was gone, David rose from the south side and fell on his face to the ground and bowed 3 times. And they kissed each other and wept together. But David wept the more. Jonathan said to David, go in safety, inasmuch as we have sworn to each other in the name of the Lord, saying, the Lord will be between me and you, and between my descendants and your descendants forever. Then he rose and departed, while Jonathan went into the city. So we see this moment of departure where they know when they know that David has to flee from their sight. We're going to see David hiding in caves here in the near future. But we see this amazing moment. They're moved to tears with each other because of this deep friendship that they had for one another. And they're grieving over the situation that they are in, that they have to separate. They're greatly emotional. And they're moved to this emotion because of that deep concern and that deep love that they have for one another. That is the type of friendship that these two men had. Romans 12 and verse 15, Paul tells us to rejoice with those who rejoice and weep with those who weep. Jesus had this same characteristic in John 11 when he goes to raise Lazarus from the dead. But before he gets there, Lazarus dies, and all the people are lamenting and mourning and weeping. And Jesus sees this, and it says he was greatly moved. And it says Jesus wept in John 11 and in verse 35. That is what friends do. They feel the emotions of their friends. When they are happy, when something is good has happened in their life, they rejoice over those things. When something sad has happened, when they are in mourning, we are to be in mourning with them, just like Jonathan was with David. And then last of all, this friendship is strong when it is based on mutual faith in God. That's how we started, that Jonathan admired David's faith and his courage. David, no doubt, admired the faith and the courage of Jonathan. And in 1 Samuel 23, when Jonathan is able to get away and go and meet David again, it says in verse 16, and Jonathan, Saul's son, arose and went to David at Horesh and encouraged him in God. Thus he said to him, do not be afraid, because the hand of Saul my father will not find you. And you will be king over Israel, and I will be next to you. And Saul my father knows that also. So the two of them made a covenant before the Lord. And David stayed at Horesh while Jonathan went to his house. We see it started with their mutual admiration for their courage and faith in God. When Jonathan goes to David, it says he encourages him. How? He encourages him in God. It says they make a covenant in the Lord. Their friendship was strong because it was built on the foundation of their mutual faith in God. And that is the strong foundation of any friendship. It should be based in our love and our respect and our faith and our obedience in God. That is what we see in the story of David and Jonathan. What's interesting, just another point there to point out in 1 Samuel 23, where Jonathan talks about, and he says, you will be king over Israel. I find that interesting, right? Because most kingdoms, they follow the lineage, right? The son of Saul would be the next king of Israel if they were following the lineage. That is how it happens most often. Jonathan should have been the next king, but Jonathan recognizes the will of the Lord. He's not jealous. He's not envious that he's not going to get to be the king. He recognizes the will of God, and the will of God is for David to be the king. And he rejoices and he's glad over that fact. Just another little detail that shows you something about the character of Jonathan and the nature of their friendship. So yes, what an amazing friendship this is. What a number of lessons that we can learn for the friendships that we have in our own lives. Proverbs 18 and verse 24, as we conclude this morning, it says, "A man who has friends must himself be friendly, but there is a friend who sticks closer than a brother." And I think that's what we see here in the story of David and Jonathan. A friend who sticks closer than a brother. Yes, Jonathan loved David as he loved himself. Let's learn from this and let's apply these lessons to the friendships that we have with one another. If you're here this morning and you have not yet obeyed the gospel, then there's no better time than now to come forward believing that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, to confess that belief before all of us gathered here this morning, and to be buried in the waters of baptism. If you owe that duty to the Lord, we ask that you come now as we stand and sing this song.